Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for coming to the fifth installment of the Racial Equity and Justice series that UAS Title III has been putting on. Big thanks to everybody for taking time to join us tonight, and a big thanks to UAS Sitka Campus Title III for sponsoring such a great series that started September 10th, and we have a finale tonight with Dionne Brady-Howard, and then a chance for you to discuss with some of your neighbors what it is that you learned from Dionne's talk and from the whole series. So as usual, we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. This is a very fitting one because Dionne helped us to wordsmith this one. It was used at Indigenous Peoples Day last year, and we're going to have somebody in the decolonization discussion group read it, and then also you'll be able to maybe see it in the chat. So let me turn it over to Missy for the land acknowledgement tonight. Missy?
Hi, thank you, Doug. So for everyone tuning in here in Sitka, we'd like to start by recognizing that we are on Tlingit Ani. Ani is the Tlingit word for land, and the Tlingit people have been in this place for over 10,000 years. It's important to recognize this historical fact and appreciate that the Tlingit people have been excellent stewards and have lived out their traditional tribal values around balance, respect, and caring for the earth that sustains us all. So for taking wonderful care of this special place for time immemorial, I'd like to say thank you and gunachish. You're still on mute, Doug.
Thank you, Missy. So we're here for an hour from 7 to 8. We're going to hear an introduction of our keynote, and then we'll hear her presentation. Then you'll have a chance to ask some questions of Dionne. And then the second half, you're going to be in a group of 4. So it'll be you and 3 other people. And we have some prompts. And you're going to split time and just talk about some of the things that we've been learning and discussing and thinking about in the last few weeks. And then the last 5 minutes, you'll see what's coming next. We're hoping that this speaker series was the start of some big things in Southeast Alaska, and there's some pretty exciting things that are coming as soon as next week that you're invited to participate and help to deepen that learning and help us to make progress as a community. So now I'm going to turn over to one of the sponsors. We had a lot of great sponsors, STA Social Services and Search and the Health Summit and Pathways Coalition, UAS, of course. We also had SAFE. So I'm going to turn over to Martina Kurzer, who works at SAFE and is going to introduce your keynote speaker for today. Martina.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for the honor to introduce Dionne. When I thought back when I first met Dionne, I could not even remember. So I guess it's about 20 years at a time when I joined the Alaska Native Sisterhood Camp 4 and frequented the A&B Hall. And Dionne, the first time I met her in her role as a granddaughter. As a granddaughter of ANS President Isabella Brady, the late Isabella Brady, who was an amazing leader for her people, educator. She brought back the language and the culture with other elders, of course, by founding the Sitka Native Education Program. And she was a fierce fighter and advocate for social justice for the local people here. And her granddaughter was basically introduced to this kind of work style that Isabella modeled. Isabella was very demanding from all who rallied around her, but she was herself the hardest worker. And that's the culture in which Dionne grew up. I know her then next as a drummer, as a singer, a presenter of Tlingit dancers. And I really always remember her very strong voice and her capacity and integrity to prevent and represent her culture. I also experienced her as a dance teacher with an amazing, unbelievable repertoire of clan-owned songs. She jumps from one song with one melody to another, and boom, boom, boom. And I don't know how many hundreds of songs she has on standby. I, of course, also experienced her in her role as a mother to her daughter, Izzy. She was, however, not only the mother to Izzy. I saw her mothering many other young people, stepchildren, other close relatives. And I know from watching her from afar that she also seems to mother her students, because Dionne is also one of her many roles, a Mount Edgecumbe High School teacher for government. And she instills her values onto her students and is working very hard. She is a very spirited and inspiring speaker and presenter. I know that because several times I invited her, many times actually, I invited her to be a speaker at one of our community trainings. Dionne was always very willing to come and talk on behalf of her culture and her history, the history of the people who have always been here in this place for time immemorial. And in this context, I remember one slide that she showed that showed her family tree, and her family tree goes at least back to the time of the quarrels, the war, the time when the Russians invaded this. So she is a descendant of a long, long line of leaders, women and men, and one of her great-great-grandfathers was a founder of A&B, and her mother is a leader, her grandmother. I mentioned that. So Dionne is also a speaker for social justice causes. We very recently could witness that in front of the Centennial Building, where she spoke on behalf of all people who believe in social justice. And she is fearless, fierce, eloquent, elegant, beautiful, and a force to reckon with. I so look forward to listen to you, Dionne. Thank you.
Yeri kuk ayu khat dua sak, kicks adi khat city. Kachat jashayu ha dua sak tegwedi yeri ayachat. Kakahit da khat city. Kagwantanda chen ayachat. My Tlingit name is Yeri Kuk-A, and I carry the Tlingit name of my late grandmother, Isabella Brady. And I am from the Kiks-Adi clan. A lot of people include in their traditional Tlingit introduction what moiety they're from, but I was also taught that traditionally we wouldn't really do that, because anyone who knows our clan system would know when I said that I was Kiks-Adi that that's one of the clans that comes under the Raven moiety. The women of my clan are called the Kachat Jasha, and there's no really convenient English translation for that. We often just translate it simply as herring ladies, though that isn't really quite accurate, because Kachatja is one of those specialized words that can't really be translated without telling the whole story that goes behind it. We're a matrilineal society, so I am the clan that my mother and her mother are, but we also acknowledge our father's people, and so I am the child of the Teakwedi clan and the grandchild of the Kagwantan clan. I was talking to my Alaska history class the other day about how if we're introducing ourselves traditionally, whether it's Tlingit people or other indigenous people across the state, that a lot of the time an introduction really does involve saying who your parents are, who your grandparents are, not only to honor your heritage, but to also give an idea to people what the connections might be between you and those other folks. From the introduction that Martina so graciously just gave, I think that it's pretty evident that I come from a long line of people who have engaged in activism and have sought to make a difference in our community and our state and even our world in the things that they did. And so it was kind of a daunting upbringing. You know, not just my grandmother, but my grandparents and also my mother. And just that notion that we have a responsibility. My grandmother always used to say, for of those to whom much is given, much is required. And so that really is sort of the legacy that I was brought up in. Full disclosure, I just want to begin by saying that I don't have a nonprofit organization or a title or a career in promoting social justice or racial equity. I'm not an expert in terms of any kind of study formally, but what I do have is a lifetime of experience as an Indigenous woman, as one part of a minority in a small town with a long history of colonization. I have a story, actually several, surrounding what it was like growing up brown in our little town. Stories that involve being made fun of by my peers for dancing with our Native youth dance group, hearing cruel teasing. And it wasn't just the usual middle school hazing, but it was kind of a mocking that dripped with racial undertones and even overtones for that matter, as well as years of adults turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to all of that. Now, granted, it was just teasing. And by that, I mean that I do have to acknowledge that it wasn't physical violence. It didn't involve death threats directed at me or my family, but it did strike at our very core because it was systemic. It took place in those places that were supposed to be safe and nurturing for us. And when we dared to broach the subjects of the racially based hazing or subtle exclusion from activities or of inequity in general, it was often ignored. It was downplayed, it was disregarded, and sometimes it was even justified by the powers that be. Now, when I teach history or when I present to groups of people with European descent about our local history, I have too often found myself sort of laying a padded groundwork of sorts. I have to treat that history with kid gloves. It is so hard to talk about genocide, both actual and cultural, without first issuing preemptive apologies and platitudes, constantly reminding white people that when we talk about the forced assimilation of Native people, or whether we're talking about the enslavement and subsequent disenfranchisement of African Americans, that it's not about blaming them. And so for years, we've been sort of stuck in this holding pattern of making these discussions easier for white folks. And to this day, there are far too many people who genuinely think that because we elected a Black president 12 years ago, or because the government gave land to Alaska Native corporations 49 years ago, that racism is somehow over. But the effects of slavery, segregation, and assimilation still remain. Now, I know at this point that I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but it is crucial anytime we have these discussions to acknowledge where we've been in order to get somewhere better. Honestly, it's only in recent years that we've found ourselves surrounded by what we call allies, by people who want to affect change in the ways that things have been done, who don't minimize or chastise, people who care enough to listen. And it's a far cry from where we've been. It is progress, to be sure, but it's still a far cry from where we need to be. Because of our long history of colonization, there's still a shortage of credence that's lent to Indigenous voices and perspectives, even insofar as recounting our own history and traditions. A lingering effect of centuries of all things Native being recounted in white voices from white perspectives in white history books. Speaking not for all Indigenous people, but instead speaking as an Indigenous person, I can say that we, as Indigenous people, are not there yet. Not all of us are aware of colonization and decolonization or indigenization. In fact, a great many of us are still so much the product of that colonization that not all of us even recognize oppression that was visited on our ancestors who came before us, or recognize that it's visited on us still. And that's where we get folks who do purport to speak for all the rest of us Indigenous people by validating colonizers' positions on things like the Baranof statue removal, or the rebranding of Alaska Day as a time of reconciliation for the land and cultures that were permanently stolen. This notion of white civilization and Christianization was so harshly ingrained into our ancestors that even today, we don't recognize the former or continuing effects of that forced assimilation and cultural genocide. So we say things like, I'm Native, but that statue doesn't bother me. And we continue to observe a holiday that effectively celebrates land loss and cultural genocide. But that is where we stand at this time, that not everyone gets it, and not everyone will get it. We've all experienced different effects of colonization, and as such, the irony is that we are not all educated about that colonization, and so some of us are still in the thick of it. As far as colonizing attitudes and actions with a fresh spin on them, some of that racism is blatant, and it's easy to recognize and it's easy to call out. What's harder to tackle is those behaviors and attitudes that represent a more insidious racism, as my grandma used to call it. Looking at those folks, for example, who support those people who are blatantly racist. Sadly, not everything traumatic is in the past, as evidenced by recent comments by both voters as well as elected officials, who have aptly demonstrated varying degrees of continuing colonizing and racist attitudes in our own quaint little town. Across the nation and the state, we have similar accounts of colonialism, yet every story is different. Every culture's experience has subtle nuances, and we're all at different places, either still steeped in colonization or at different places in working toward decolonizing. And we have to recognize that if we're to be able to help. And we need to acknowledge how very much we don't know. My grandma, when she would correct us, literally hated it when we would respond with, I know. She'd say, don't say, I know. Say, yes, Grandma. That was one of many lessons that she taught us, but it was probably one of the most important. Atticus Finch said, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. But when it comes to all of these questions of race relations that we're facing as a town, a state, a nation, and a world, probably the most important thing that we can do is realize how very wrong Harper Lee was about this. What we need to do instead is realize that we can't climb inside each other's skin and walk around in it. Those of us with privilege can't shake all of our privilege to truly do that. Once we can acknowledge that, maybe that is the true beginning of progress, in being able to simply say, I don't know, but I'm willing to listen and learn. And then be willing to hear tough things, and maybe be willing to say tough things to those whom we are in a position to stand up to educate, and to influence. On the other hand, we can't simply listen to the stories of people of color, and I need you to bear with me on this. For some of us, especially those of us with a thick skin and with privilege, we need to take time to listen to those who would oppress our friends of color. Those of us who are able could also benefit from finding out more about what it is that these people fear so much. It's somewhat easier to have these discussions among like-minded folks in our decolonization groups or our session or our Facebook groups. But it's much harder to go to the source. And we may never sway those opponents. In fact, we probably won't. But in learning more about what they say and what they fear, we might be able to gain insight into some folks who are reachable. and eventually make more progress where it's a little harder to do so, rather than just amongst ourselves. We need to not only be speaking truth to power, but we also need to be speaking truth to fear. While it's true that there's a lot of individual work to be done in facing our own places of power and privilege, as well as learning how to use that power and privilege to work toward true equity, we also have to learn to work together. Now, there are certainly quite a few of us, as evidenced by participation in all of these events that we've had, who understand and agree that there's so much work still to be done, but we don't all agree on how to get there. And we're going to need to find ways to work together, even when we hit roadblocks and even when we have differences, because we have enough of the other to be fighting, that we can't afford to be fighting each other, jockeying for power or influence among ourselves. We have to be willing to meet people in our own cadre where they're at and assume good intentions. Otherwise, we're defeated before we've barely even begun. Our task is a daunting one, but we're more fit to that task than we've ever been if we can remember where we've been, acknowledge where we are, and know that it's okay and even necessary to be able to say, I don't know. And most of all, we must be willing to put our egos aside and stand together, work together, and walk together. I don't pretend to know everything there is to know about equity or decolonization, but I hope that maybe I shared something this evening that gives people something to think about. And I say to you all, Gunashish, for being here, willing to listen and learn.
Great. Thanks so much, Dionne. What a wonderful, inspiring talk. We're going to have some questions now. People can put that in the chat box. And I'm going to start with the first one. It's great having an Alaska Studies teacher with us presenting tonight, so I can't resist this question. Tim Wise had said one of the things that he suggested was we take a look at our history critically. And I'm curious, what are some things in our local history that are not really known? And the reason why I'm inspired to ask that question is during the statue, I learned that the Tlingit had given Baranof the nickname No Heart. And that seems like a really important piece of understanding him, that his 18 years here, his actions have led him to have this name, to earn this name. But could you share with us what are some things that maybe aren't known, or what are some of the things about our local history that might be helpful for people to understand our past a little bit better?
Well, I think that one of the biggest things is just really kind of realizing that there's a lot of local history statewide in all of our different regions and all of our different communities that isn't even known, or more importantly, it might be known, but it's never actually been acknowledged or validated because it wasn't a written history. And understanding that probably one of the biggest roadblocks we have is that that we've got great intentions. So for example, I want to say it was about maybe 15 years ago or so that the Alaska Studies requirement was passed through the legislature in a state that tries not to dictate too many, educational mandates in a local control kind of mentality. They did successfully pass this requirement that Alaska Studies needed to be a part of a curriculum for someone to earn a diploma in the state, but then yet adequate resources have never been put behind trying to really even come up with any resources that are available for the teaching of Alaska Studies. So I, for example, as a teacher of Alaska history, find myself usually just trying to pull things together from a wide variety of sources. And then the other is just that we really haven't even reached a point in our state and in our society where oral history is considered to be valid enough that a lot of that oral history has even been documented so it can be available for the teaching. And so I know that's not like maybe as specific as what you were asking, except that I think that that's probably one of the biggest issues that we actually have.
Excellent. And people can ask, we got time for a couple more questions. Another one I was curious about is, you mentioned about the need to work together and the need to not get divided as working towards social justice. Could you expand on that a little bit? I thought that was such an important point and such an interesting point that you highlighted. Could you talk a little bit about your thinking behind that?
I think that a lot of the time we have so many people who have similar, at least very similar opinions on kind of what we need to work on as a community. For example, let's say we're just looking at Sitka. And there are people who have opinions and at least acknowledge that we're definitely not anywhere near where we need to be. But then when the rubber meets the road, we have, disagreements on things like strategy. And then the disagreements on strategy turn into sort of larger disagreements about just intent. And we fail to assume good intentions from one another, and we start to fall apart at that point. So if we're just looking maybe at what's going on in Sitka and the assembly race, for example, as a microcosm of things that likely go on in a lot of places, is, we've toggled between having a paucity of candidates who might be good for a cause like racial equity, to then having, an abundance of candidates who are actually up against candidates who are diametrically opposed to that cause, and the concern over dividing our vote, for example. So if we're going to look at it as just kind of anti-diversity / people who just, some who most of us can agree have spouted some pretty racist rhetoric, others who maybe seem to be somewhat supportive of that rhetoric, and then definitely a collection of candidates who we know are opposed to that kind of rhetoric and who are in fact supportive of issues of racial equity. When it came down to it, we were blessed with more candidates than ever who were in that camp of supportive of these kinds of issues. And yet in having that slate of candidates available, it's caused us to divide ourselves. And that's not the first and only example, and it won't be the last. But I think the most important thing to remember is that nobody's out to get anybody else. And it's just really easy when it feels personal, A, to jump to that conclusion, and then B, also not to listen to each other who are feeling like they were somehow attacked in that process. And so there's so much involved in just trying to find somewhere in the middle to meet, and to meet in a way that we're not just jumping to negative conclusions and or going into a full-on attack mode.
Thank you, Dionne. And a question that came in on the chat, it says, what do you see as Sitka's future if we continue to work? What could it look like?
I think that I don't know that I have an idealized version in my head, because it's not been that for so long. What I do recognize is that it's definitely better than it's been in my lifetime so far in the last few years. And like for me, the part that's alarming, though, is when I say that, we definitely have candidates who we know are opposed to issues of racial equity and who are in fact racially divisive. It's really hard, when I've been feeling more hopeful about the direction we're heading, to see folks who, a lot of us were surprised to see willing to support that kind of, racist rhetoric. And to know that those are the people who still live among us is hard. And I didn't have any illusions that we didn't have people in Sitka who still felt that way, but where it became tough was starting to see how many people in Sitka were willing to support someone who has been so toxic in terms of the things that are posted about Native people, about people of color in general, and then just, violent and threatening rhetoric in regard to those people and anyone who supports those particular groups. So I feel like I simultaneously have hope, knowing, that I've seen so many people who've just sort of come in and are willing to have tough conversations and do the work, but then also at the same time feeling discouraged. For me, what it would probably look like is working on maybe like a more, I don't know if I want to say accurate, but more like inclusive curriculum that doesn't glorify the colonization of Sitka and Alaska and the United States. More of a deeper awareness that our kids will get through a school system, for example, about what actually happened, because I think that a lot of the problems that we still have even though our people, for example, right now aren't really being punished actively in schools or by churches for speaking our native languages, there are so many people who don't realize that that's both the educational and religious legacy in our state, and that that trauma and the effects of it still remain in our population. And so I would say that I think that the beginning of that has to be in just a deeper education of our own history of colonization. And then, you know, beyond that, looking at, I'd say, like, more acknowledgement of the validity of Native cultures as actually being the majority of the history of our state. It's not like a timeline of history like you might classically study, but one of the things I look at when I teach Alaska history is I look at the entire timeline of people in Alaska, and then I look at how much of that 8,000 to 10,000 years, depending on, you know, who you believe in terms of some of the carbon dating of artifacts, how much of that is actually of contact. And it's, I mean, it's kind of like a dot on that timeline if we're just making a timeline that's like this big. And so in my own Alaska history class, the Alaska Native Cultures Unit is quite lengthy in recognition of the fact that that is the majority of the history of Alaska.
And Dionne, we're going to jump into breakouts, but I want to ask this last question that came in, and it kind of connects a little bit with Megan Redshirt Shaw's presentation for us on Monday. So this last question says, how do you think, if at all, the nationwide Black Lives Movement has changed the work and opposition around decolonization and racial equity work in Sitka?
I think that, you know, there's pros and cons to everything. I think that when you look at it in some ways, some of those movements and then the different sort of different related tangents that took off in the lower 48 regarding things like Black Lives Matter, and then some of the like subsequent statue removals, for example, of like Confederate statues, it sort of prompted a little bit of like an awakening in Sitka that, hey, maybe there's some things here that we need to work on. But then it also sort of prompted that backlash that people have against, well, we're not like the lower 48. Because, you know, Alaskans are notorious for having this sort of, you know, self-view of rugged independence and, you know, the whole idea that we're not like everybody else. And so there was kind of a backlash that came with that as well. And so I think that it definitely had both a measure of inspiration as well as a measure of people resisting any of the ideas brought forth. But I think that probably one of the things that we did find, and that's something we're continuing to work on, is that whether we were looking at you know, pulling together Indigenous Peoples Day last year when it wasn't, you know, being sponsored by one agency anymore, and sort of that coming together of several people from several agencies to make that happen, whether we're looking at Reconciliation Day and the activities and the organizing related to replacing Alaska Day with Reconciliation Day, whether we're looking at herring causes, whether we're looking at Black Lives Matter, we started to see that A, there was a lot of overlap, but B, we were also almost reinventing the wheel every time. And it sort of, I think, provided the inspiration for the fact that, okay, why are we so fragmented into several different causes when in fact we should be pooling our resources more, when there are all these people who are progressive, who are aware that change needs to happen. And it's probably one of the most exciting things in Sitka for as long as I can remember. And it's not perfect, but it's still exciting. And so just like with anything else, it's a journey.
And we're so glad you're on this journey with us, Dionne. Thank you for taking the time tonight to share. I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to send you a chat and say thank you. And so people can do that. What we're going to do is segue into the second half. And this is a chance for people to connect and talk. You're going to be in breakout groups of 4 people. And there's going to be a series of questions, and it's going to start with what did you get out of tonight's presentation or some of the other speaking that you heard, and then you'll work through. We're going to ask that people split time So what that means is that you'll talk for 25% of your time and listen for 75. So you all take turns. You can go around the circle. We did ask people from the Monday night decolonization discussion group to do some light facilitation. So in your group, if there's a decolonization discussion group person, they'll kind of help get you started. You may be meeting people for the first time, so definitely introduce yourself. And it's just a chance to share. Look over your notes, think about what you heard tonight, think about what you heard over the speaking series, and then we'll come back here, and then we have some pretty special announcements to end with. So Leah, who is another person we need to thank. There's a lot of pressure when you're like the Zoom person for a speaking series that's all online. So make sure you thank Dionne, thank Leah, thank Dr. Kraft, thank everybody who's made this happen. And we're going to go to breakouts. We'll be back for some special announcements at the end. So Leah, thanks for getting us into breakouts. We'll be back here at the group level in about 25 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. And thanks for doing the breakout group, sticking with us to the end. And we're going to do some next steps announcements. If you want, you can chat to the people in your group maybe and share anything on ideas for next steps. But we're going to share a couple. Leah, if you could put the slides up. One of the things that's exciting about the speaker series is all of these have been recorded. And so one of the neat things is that you're going to be able to hear the recordings, but we also have some other follow-ups. Dr. Kraft, we're a little over on time, but if you could just share what this opportunity is that's coming up a week from today.
Yeah, week from at noon today. Yeah, I think many of you have experienced what I'm experienced, where you're wanting to talk to like-minded people and have some meaningful conversations along the lines of, now what? How do I make a difference? How do I take this, all of these thoughts and not just leave it in the past and look back at it as, well, that was a nice experience, but what now? So the first Thursday of every month, starting this coming Thursday, we'll do have a time for people to have these kinds of conversations. We're going to do little clips of the presenters. So it's kind of like a book study. Instead of studying a chapter, we're just going to study 10 minutes of a clip and then have conversations and be able to practice what our speaker talked about today. At least I'm planning on it, of being able to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn, and you all are my teachers. And so the first Thursday of every month, we'll have a chance to do that. So I invite you. I hope to see you next Thursday on your computer screen.
Thanks, Dr. Kraft. So if you're interested in policy or interested in taking these ideas, bringing them to action, that's one option. And then Leah, could you go to the next slide? So another thing that's coming up, it starts on October the 15th, also a Thursday, the Racial Healing Handbook by Dr. Annalise Singh. She is a licensed professional counselor. We actually have 33 copies, complimentary copies. You get a free book. You can also go down to Old Harbor and buy that. But it's a book study. And in October, we have the kickoff, chapters 1 through 5 in November. And then actually the author is going to Zoom in with us thanks to the Friends of the Sitka Public Library and Sitka Counseling. So thanks to all the sponsors for that. So if you really want to go deep, internal transformation, change yourself, and then change the world, this is the book for you. Dr. Singh is brilliant, and I highly recommend it. A couple other final things. There's a decolonization discussion group. It meets every Monday on Zoom from 7 to 8:30. You're welcome to do that as well. So we are at the end of our speaker series, the end of our time. Thanks to Dionne. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. Thanks for UAS Sitka Campus, Dr. Kraft, who you just heard from, our partners at the Sitka Tribe of Alaska Social Services, Search, the Sitka STEPS grant, the Sitka School District is where the STEPS grant is, along with STA, the Sitka Health Summit, and the Pathways Coalition. So we're going to stay on, leave the chat open. You have a minute to type things in the chat, connect with people, do your thank yous and appreciations. It has been a great, great series, and I'm just so appreciative that I live in a place that has people that are wanting to learn and grow and make our world healthier and better. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.